The Mongol Empire was the largest connected land empire the world has ever seen, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the gates of Europe. It was built entirely on one terrifying idea: that no army, no city, and no king could stand in its way. And for over a century, nothing did. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. The men who built and ruled that empire, the Khans themselves, the ones who made entire civilizations kneel, could not outrun the one enemy that comes for everyone eventually. Some died in battle. Some died from wounds you'd expect a conqueror to die from. And some, the most powerful men alive, died in ways so undignified, so quietly absurd, that history almost seems embarrassed to admit it. 8 rulers, 8 different downfalls. One of them will be brought down not by an enemy blade, but by his own horse, on what should have been a routine hunting trip. Another falls after one final night of celebration he never wakes up from. And at the very end of this list sits the wealthiest, most powerful man on the entire planet at the time, ruler of more land than any human being before or since. His death has nothing to do with war, poison, or betrayal.
It's something far more ordinary and far harder to admit for a man who once commanded the known world. Stay until the end for that one, because it might be the strangest exit of any ruler on this list. Historians have spent centuries picking apart these deaths, because the further you get from the battlefield, the murkier the official record tends to get. Court chroniclers had every reason to soften an embarrassing ending, and empires built on fear had even more reason to hide a moment of weakness from the people they ruled. So keep that in mind as we go, because more than once, what actually killed these men and what the empire told its people at the time were 2 very different stories. Let's start where the empire itself started, with the man who built it. By 1227, Genghis Khan had already turned half the known world into a graveyard. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, all of it had fallen beneath his armies. And now, in his mid-60s, he was leading yet another campaign, this time against the kingdom of Western Xia. This wasn't supposed to be the campaign that ended him. If anything, it looked routine, one more territory to fold into an empire that had already swallowed most of the map. While out hunting during the campaign, something went wrong that no army could have prevented. His horse, startled by something no one could later explain, suddenly bolted beneath him. Genghis Khan, a man who had survived decades of warfare, hit the ground with tremendous force. He was carried back to his tent that night, and what followed was days of fever, sweating, and silence, while an entire army camped outside, waiting for a command that never came. Officially, for a long time afterward, the empire told a very different story about how their founder died, because morale mattered more than accuracy. But historians now largely agree on what actually happened in that tent. The fall from his horse caused internal injuries his body simply could not recover from, and the man who conquered nations died not from a sword, not from an enemy, but from the impact of hitting the ground. His body was reportedly carried back through the same lands he'd conquered, and even the location of his final burial was deliberately erased, hidden so thoroughly that to this day nobody has ever definitively found his grave. His empire didn't slow down after that. If anything, it kept expanding, and leadership passed to his son, a man who inherited his father's ambition but not his caution. Ogedei Khan nearly finished what his father started, pushing Mongol forces deep into Europe until entire kingdoms braced for what seemed like an unstoppable invasion. But Ogedei carried a reputation that had nothing to do with the battlefield. Everyone around him knew about his appetite for wine, and everyone around him also knew better than to say anything about it. In the winter of 1241, Ogedei hosted an enormous celebration, one of many in a lifetime full of them. There was laughter that night, plans for future conquests, toast after toast late into the evening. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the man who ruled an empire stretching across 2 continents was found slumped in his chair, unable to speak, unable to move. The Khan, who very nearly conquered Europe, wasn't stopped by a rival army or a fortified city. He was stopped by his own celebration, a massive stroke brought on by a night of extreme drinking that his body simply couldn't survive. The invasion of Europe, already in motion, was called back almost immediately, and historians still debate how differently the continent's history might have unfolded if that one night had gone differently. Some historians go as far as to argue that a single hangover, in the most literal sense, may have saved Western Europe from a Mongol invasion it had no real way of stopping.
After Ogedei, tension inside the empire only grew, especially between his successor and one particular rival who refused to bend the knee. Guyuk Khan's short reign was defined almost entirely by a looming confrontation with his cousin, Batu Khan, a rivalry so serious that Guyuk eventually gathered a massive military escort and began moving west, and everyone in the empire understood exactly what that movement likely meant. War between two branches of the same family looked unavoidable. Then, while traveling through East Turkestan, Guyuk made a stop that should have been routine.
He retired to his private tent for the night. He was young. He was healthy. There was no reported illness beforehand, no obvious warning sign. And he simply never came back out. Officially, his death was recorded as natural causes, closed and filed away without much further explanation.
But many historians studying the timing believe something far more calculated took place, that members of his own inner circle, fearing the purges he was expected to launch once the confrontation with Batu began, made sure he never lived to start them. Whether it was poison or simply convenient silence, the war everyone expected never happened, because the man who was supposed to lead it was suddenly gone.
Batu Khan, the cousin he was riding toward, never had to lift a single sword, and some historians can't help but notice how convenient that timing turned out to be for him. The empire's next major ruler wouldn't fall to family politics at all. His enemy was something far smaller and far harder to fight back against. Monkey Khan was leading a brutal siege against the Diaoyu fortress in 1259, pushing his army through sweltering, punishing conditions that had already worn down soldiers far younger than he was. For a while, he seemed untouchable, the kind of commander whose presence alone kept an army moving forward. Then, he simply stopped showing up. He missed briefings. His skin turned a sickly yellow.
He grew thinner by the week, and eventually, the man who had commanded armies across 2 continents became too physically weak to even sit on his own horse. This wasn't the kind of decline that came from a wound or an ambush. This was something happening from the inside. Monkey Khan, ruler of the largest land empire in history, was ultimately defeated.
The siege that was supposed to expand his empire further instead became the place where it quietly, unglamorously ended for him. His death, far from any real battlefield, would go on to reshape the balance of power across the entire empire, triggering a succession dispute that would eventually split the Mongol world for good. His death sent shockwaves through the family, and one of his brothers, already deep into his own campaign of conquest, would eventually meet an entirely different kind of enemy. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, was the man responsible for one of the most infamous acts of destruction in the empire's history, the leveling of Baghdad. By 1265, he was still planning further conquests, still expanding the reach of a family that had already reshaped the map of the known world. Then something began happening to his body that had nothing to do with warfare. Violent, uncontrollable fits started overtaking him, leaving him incapacitated for hours at a time. His doctors could only watch as his strength drained away episode after episode, with no battlefield explanation for what was happening. The man who destroyed one of the greatest cities on Earth was ultimately brought down by epilepsy, a series of severe seizures his body eventually could not recover from. The destroyer of Baghdad, feared across entire regions, was defeated by something happening entirely inside his own skull. The empire he ruled continued on without him, but the campaigns he'd been planning quietly stalled, unfinished business left behind by a body that simply refused to cooperate any longer. Meanwhile, far to the north, another branch of the family had built an empire of its own, one that would terrorize an entire nation for generations. Its founder's death would remain shrouded in far more mystery than almost anyone else's on this list. Batu Khan, founder of the Golden Horde, spent decades as the man Russia feared more than any other. By 1255, he was at the absolute height of his power, controlling vast territory and commanding total loyalty from those beneath him. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, he fell ill and withdrew to his private quarters in his capital of Sarai. Almost immediately, rumors began to spread, whispers of political poisoning, of rivals finally finding their opening after years of being unable to touch him. The timing, so soon after reaching the peak of his influence, made plenty of people suspicious. Officially, though, the records are almost frustratingly simple. Batu Khan died of natural causes at the age of 50, reportedly just failing to wake up one morning, having stopped breathing quietly in his sleep. No confirmed poison, no confession, just an official record that gives you everything and somehow tells you almost nothing at all.
The golden horde he built would go on to dominate the region for another 2 centuries, long enough that his own uncertain ending eventually became little more than a footnote to the empire he left behind. More than a century later, one final conqueror would try to rebuild what these men had created, and nature itself would refuse to let him finish the journey.
Tamerlane spent his life chasing the dream of restoring the old Mongol Empire to its former glory, and in 1405 he set out with 200,000 men, marching toward China during one of the coldest winters ever recorded in the region. Most commanders would have paused. Tamerlane pushed forward anyway, refusing to let weather dictate the pace of his ambition. The cold didn't care about ambition. A persistent cough took hold of him first, followed by a burning fever that refused to break. Within days, the man who had terrorized armies across Asia was reduced to lying delirious in a litter, unable to lead, unable to even fully recognize where he was. Tamerlane never reached the border he was marching toward. He was defeated not by an opposing army, but by the extreme cold itself, an illness the freezing conditions made impossible for his aging body to survive. The empire he'd hoped to rebuild died with him on that frozen march, still hundreds of miles from its intended destination. His body was carried the rest of the way home rather than his army, and the invasion that might have reshaped the region one more time simply dissolved before it ever crossed the border. And now, the death nobody expects, because this final ruler on our list didn't fall to weather, disease, betrayal, or a battlefield wound. He fell to something far more ordinary and far harder for history to romanticize. Kublai Khan ruled more territory than any human being in history up to that point, founder of the Yuan dynasty and master of an empire so vast it's difficult to fully comprehend even today. In his final years, though, that unimaginable power came with an equally unimaginable amount of comfort, and Kublai fell into it completely. After personal losses left him in a deep depression, Kublai sought comfort the only way an emperor of his means could, in the finest food and wine the empire could produce, without limit, without restraint, for years on end. His body paid the price for it. He grew so large that walking became difficult, then eventually impossible, while agonizing joint inflammation left him in near constant pain. The man who once owned more of the earth than anyone alive was ultimately killed by his own appetite, dying from complications of morbid obesity and severe gout. Not a rival army, not a rebellion, not even a disease with an exotic name. Just decades of unrestrained excess catching up all at once with a man who had never once in his entire life been told no. 8 rulers, 8 completely different ends. A conqueror undone by a startled horse. A drinker who never woke up from his own celebration. A Khan silenced in a tent under circumstances that still don't fully add up. A commander beaten by bacteria in his own gut. A destroyer of cities defeated by his own mind. A founder whose death remains an open question to this day. A conqueror frozen mid-march by weather he refused to respect. And an emperor who ruled the known world only to be undone by the one appetite he could never bring himself to control. If there's a thread connecting all 8 of these endings, it's this. An empire built on absolute control over everything outside their bodies couldn't save a single one of them from what was happening inside their own.